My name is Thomas Garrett, and I'm 64 years old. Before you keep watching, I want you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you is the hardest thing I've ever put into words, and I spent 31 years as a police dispatcher in Nashville, listening to people describe the worst moments of their lives. I thought I'd heard everything. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. This story is about my father, a man who built houses with his hands for 40 years and never once asked anyone for help. And it's about my wife of 35 years, the woman I thought I knew better than I knew myself. I'm sharing this because I believe someone watching right now needs to hear it. I grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, third of 4 kids, in a house my father built himself on a half-acre lot off Trenton Road. My father, Harold Garrett, was the kind of man people used to call a man's man. Not in the arrogant way, but in the quiet, dependable way. He showed up. For everything. Every baseball game, every school play, every flat tire in the rain. He was there. He worked construction his entire career, eventually running his own small crew. Never got rich, but never missed a mortgage payment either. My mother passed away from breast cancer when I was 38. My father held himself together for us kids, and then he quietly fell apart alone, the way men of his generation did. He never remarried, said there was no point trying to improve on perfection. My wife Linda and I met in 1989 at a 4th of July party at a mutual friend's house in Brentwood. She was 26 and working as a dental hygienist. I was 29, freshly hired at the emergency dispatch center. We were married 11 months later. We had 1 child together, our son Marcus, who lives in Phoenix now with his wife and 2 little girls. I should tell you about Marcus because it matters later. He and Linda have always had a complicated relationship. She loves him. I know she does. But somewhere along the way, she started treating him more like a project than a person, criticizing his choices, his wife, his parenting. When he moved to Phoenix 6 years ago, it wasn't just for the job opportunity. I understood that even if I never said it out loud, my father was healthy and sharp well into his 80s. He kept a garden, drove himself everywhere, went to church every Sunday, called me every Thursday at exactly 7 in the evening. Then, about 2.5 years ago, the calls started changing. He'd forget things mid-sentence. He'd repeat a question I'd just answered. Once he called me at 2 in the morning, convinced it was Thursday evening, and couldn't understand why I sounded groggy. I drove up to Clarksville to see him, and the house told me everything his voice on the phone hadn't. Mail piled by the door, dishes in the sink that hadn't been washed in days, milk in the fridge that had expired 2 weeks prior. He was sitting in his recliner watching a game show when I walked in, happy to see me, completely unaware that anything was wrong. The doctor diagnosed him with early Parkinson's, combined with the beginning stages of vascular dementia. The Parkinson's was mild at that stage, a slight tremor in his left hand, some stiffness in his gait. The dementia was the bigger concern, slow-moving but real and progressing. He could still hold a full conversation, still remembered his grandchildren's birthdays, still told the same 3 jokes he'd been telling since 1987. But he couldn't live alone anymore. That much was clear. My sister Janet lives in Murfreesboro, but she's got 3 teenagers and a husband who travels for work constantly. My brother Dale is in Knoxville, and he and my father have had a rough relationship for decades over some old business dispute I've never fully understood. My youngest sister Kay moved to Oregon years ago, and we're close, but she's a nurse with 12-hour shifts and 2 rescue dogs in a small apartment. There was really only one realistic option, and I'd known it before I even started making phone calls. I brought it up to Linda on a Sunday morning in March, 2 years ago. We were having breakfast on the back porch, coffee, and the newspaper, the way we'd done most Sunday mornings for 30 years. I told her what the doctor had said. I told her the situation. I said I thought Dad should come live with us. We have a 4-bedroom house. I'm home most days since I took early retirement the previous fall. We have the room, we have the time, and he's my father. Linda set down her coffee mug. She looked out at the backyard for a long moment. She didn't look angry or upset. She looked like she was calculating something. Then she turned back to me and said she understood that, of course, family comes first, that we'd figure it out together. She said she did want me to be the primary caregiver since she still had her part-time hours at the dental office, 3 days a week, and she had her book club and her walking group and her volunteer hours at the church thrift store. I said, of course. He's my father, I told her. I'll handle it. She nodded and picked up her coffee again, and that was that. The conversation felt almost too easy. But I told myself that was a good thing. Dad moved in the second week of April. We put him in the downstairs bedroom, the one with its own bathroom, and a window that looks out at the backyard. He'd always been partial to gardens. I moved some of his things in, his old recliner, the framed photos from his living room, his collection of Louis L'Amour paperbacks that lined an entire shelf from floor to ceiling. He sat in that recliner the first evening and looked around the room and said it was real nice. Real nice, son. That was high praise from Harold Garrett. The first 2 months were genuinely good. Dad and I fell into a routine. I'd make breakfast every morning, nothing fancy, eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes on weekends. We'd eat together and he'd tell me stories from his construction days, stories I'd heard 100 times but that I never got tired of. In the afternoons we'd sit out back if the weather allowed. Sometimes he'd help me in the yard, not much, but he liked to feel useful. Liked to deadhead the roses or tell me I was doing the edging wrong. Linda was cordial. Not warm, exactly, but cordial. She'd say good morning to him, ask if he needed anything, make sure he had his afternoon medications. It wasn't loving the way I'd hoped, but it wasn't unkind either. I told myself it was an adjustment period. Having another person in the house, after years of it being just the two of us, takes time. Then, sometime around late June, I started noticing things, small things at first. Dad seemed more tired than usual. He'd nap in the afternoons, which he'd never done before. His appetite was off. I'd put a full plate in front of him and he'd eat half and say he wasn't hungry. He started moving more slowly, which could have been the Parkinson's, but it felt different. He'd always been slow but deliberate. Now he seemed hesitant, cautious. Like he was watching where he put his feet, not because of his balance, but because he was worried about something I couldn't see. And then I noticed something that I cannot explain away with Parkinson's or dementia or anything medical. He'd gotten nervous around Linda. Not just quiet, nervous. If she walked into a room where he was sitting, he'd straighten up, put his hands in his lap, stop talking mid-sentence. He'd watch her the way you watch someone you're not sure you can trust. Once I came into the living room and he was watching television and Linda was standing in the doorway saying something to him and his hands were trembling. Not the light Parkinson's tremor he always had, but a different kind. The kind that comes from the chest, not the nerves. I asked him about it one evening when Linda was at her book club. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner and I asked him straight out, "Dad, are you doing okay? Are you comfortable here?" He looked at his hands for a long time before he answered. "Sure," he said. "Sure, Tommy. I'm fine." He used my childhood name. He only did that when he was emotional or when he was trying hard not to be. I asked if there was anything bothering him, anything at all, and he said no. Then after a pause he said, "Linda's got a lot on her plate. I don't want to be a burden." I told him he wasn't a burden, that we wanted him here, that I was glad he was here. He nodded slowly. "If you say so," he said. He didn't say it like he believed me. That conversation followed me to bed. I lay awake that night thinking about all the small moments I'd half noticed and half dismissed. The way Linda would sigh, sharp and audible, when Dad moved slowly to the table. The clipped, impatient tone she used if he asked her a question twice. The way she always had somewhere to be when it came time to sit with him. But I told myself that wasn't abuse. That was just stress. That was just two people who didn't have a natural ease with each other, trying to share a house. I told myself I was projecting, that I'd spent 3 decades listening to people describe terrible things, and now I saw terrible things where there were none. Then I found the bruise. It was a Tuesday morning in July. I'd been up early to fix a leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom, and I came downstairs around 6:30 to find Dad already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in his robe. He startled when I came in, then relaxed when he saw it was me. "You're up early," I said. He said he hadn't slept well. I poured us both some coffee and sat across from him, and that's when I saw it. He reached for his mug, and his robe sleeve slid up, and there on his forearm, just above his wrist, was a bruise. Dark, greenish-purple at the center, the size of a silver dollar. I leaned across the table and looked at it and asked him what happened. He pulled his sleeve down immediately, said he'd bumped it on the door frame going to the bathroom in the night. He said it like he'd rehearsed it, smooth and quick and not looking at me. I asked if he was sure, told him that was a significant bruise for a door frame. He said he bruised easily anymore, that it was the blood thinners, that I shouldn't fuss. I let it go. I didn't want to push him if he was embarrassed about a fall. Old men don't always want to admit when their bodies betray them. But I didn't forget it. 2 weeks later, a bruise on his upper arm, then one on his shin that he said was from the coffee table. Each explanation was delivered with the same rehearsed smoothness, the same refusal to meet my eyes. And each time, something in me screamed that the explanation didn't fit the bruise. I know what falls look like. I know what happens when a body catches a door frame or a table corner. I spent 3 decades on the phone with people who'd been hurt by accidents and people who'd been hurt by other people. And one thing I learned is that those 2 kinds of injuries have different shapes. I didn't want to believe what I was thinking. This was Linda, the woman I'd built a life with, the woman who'd sat beside me in the hospital when Marcus broke his arm at 9 years old, who'd held my hand at my mother's funeral, who'd brought me soup every day for a week when I had pneumonia in 2017. She was not capable of what I was starting to think she might be doing. She was not that person. She could not be that person. But I kept thinking about my father's hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with Parkinson's. I decided I needed to know the truth, not to confirm my suspicions, not because I was certain, but because if I was wrong, I needed to know that too. I needed to stop lying awake at 3 a.m. running scenarios through my head. I needed to see it clearly, one way or the other. I drove to a Best Buy in Nashville on a Wednesday afternoon when Linda was at the dental office and Dad was napping. I told the kid working the electronics section that I needed a small security camera for inside the house. He showed me several. I picked one that was compact, had clear night vision, could be triggered by motion, and recorded to a memory card. It cost me $180. I paid cash. I'd thought about that ahead of time. When I got home, I sat in my car in the driveway for a while before I went inside. I wasn't sure I had the right to do this. I wasn't sure what it meant about my marriage, that I was even considering it. But then I thought about my father saying, I don't want to be a burden in that voice, and I got out of the car. I set the camera up that evening while Dad was watching the news and Linda was making a phone call upstairs. His room had a bookshelf along the east wall, and he kept a few framed photographs on it, his and my mother's wedding photo. A picture of all 4 of us kids at Christmas from 1983. I positioned the camera behind the Christmas photo, angled toward his bed. The lens was barely visible, a small dark eye behind the silver frame. I tested the angle on my phone. You could see the whole room. I set it to motion activated. Then I put my phone back in my pocket and went to help set the table for dinner. That night, I could barely make conversation. Linda talked about a difficult patient at work. Dad ate half his chicken and said he was tired. I watched them both across the table, looking for something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. After dinner, we watched television together, the 3 of us in the living room, which was rare. Usually, Dad went to bed first. That night, he stayed up until almost 9:30, and I wondered if, on some level, he felt safer when I was in the room. I helped him to bed. I made sure he had his water glass and his medications. I said goodnight. Then I went back downstairs, and Linda and I watched the rest of the news and went to bed ourselves. I did not sleep. I lay there in the dark, my wife's breathing slow, and even beside me, listening to the house. I don't know what I was listening for. I just lay there, rigid and awake, staring at the ceiling until somewhere after midnight, I must have finally drifted off. My alarm went off at 5:45. I got up quietly, went downstairs, made coffee, waited until 6:30 when Linda came down dressed for work. I made small talk. I watched her leave. And then I went to my father's room. He was still asleep, which was unusual. He was always an early riser. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him breathe. Then I slipped inside, took the camera from behind the Christmas photo, and brought it to my office. I closed the door. I sat down at my desk. My hands were not completely steady as I plugged the memory card into my laptop. The recording had begun at 12:49 in the morning. For the first few minutes, it was just my father sleeping, the room washed in the green-gray of night vision. I watched his chest rise and fall. I almost laughed at myself. I'd spent the whole night awake, and the camera had caught nothing but an old man sleeping. Maybe I was exactly the paranoid, over-imaginative dispatcher I'd been telling myself not to be. Then at 1:17, the door opened. Linda came into the room. She was wearing her nightgown, and her reading glasses were pushed up on her head like she'd been up doing something. She walked directly to the bed without hesitating, without looking around, like she knew exactly where she was going and had been there before. She stood over my father for a moment. Then she shook his shoulder. He woke up confused, the way elderly people do, disoriented, not sure where he was. He tried to sit up, and she put her hand flat on his chest and pushed him back against the pillow. Hard. Not a gentle guiding hand. Hard. I watched my wife stand over my father at 1:17 in the morning, and I watched his face in the night vision camera, and what I saw on it was fear. Not confusion, not grogginess. Fear, pure and immediate, like a switch had been flipped, like he knew exactly who was standing over him and exactly what was coming. She leaned down and began speaking. The camera's audio was limited, picking up fragments through the ambient hiss of the room. I could hear her tone more clearly than her words, and her tone was something I had never heard from Linda in 35 years of marriage. Low and controlled and very cold. The way certain people sound when they want you to understand that they are serious and that no one is coming to help you. I caught words, pieces of sentences. I'm not going to pretend I heard everything clearly because I didn't, and I'm not going to embellish what I know to be true. What I heard was enough. I heard her say that he was ruining everything. I heard her use the word pathetic. I heard her say that I would believe her over him, that I always did, that no one was going to take the word of a man who couldn't remember what day it was. My father didn't say anything I could make out. He lay there under the blanket and he cried, not loudly, silently, the way a person cries when they've learned that making noise doesn't help. His shoulders shook and his hands gripped the blanket, and he cried while my wife stood over him in the dark, telling him things I can never unhear. Then she grabbed his arm, his left arm, the one with the tremor. She grabbed it just above the wrist and squeezed, and I could see the tendons in her hand go tight, even through the night vision. She pulled him toward her and said something directly into his face, quiet enough that the camera didn't catch it fully, and whatever she said, he went absolutely still, the way prey animals go still. Then she released him and walked out of the room and closed the door behind her. And I watched my father lie in the dark and cry alone for 11 more minutes before he finally stopped, and I could see from the tension in his body that he wasn't sleeping. He was lying there waiting for morning. I sat at my desk for a long time after the video ended. I am not going to try to describe to you what it is like to watch something like that. I don't think I could do it accurately. I will say that I have never in my life felt so many things simultaneously that they canceled each other out and left a strange cold stillness in the middle of my chest. I sat in that stillness for a while, and then I knew what I needed to do. The first thing I needed to do was nothing. Not yet. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I know exactly how that sounds, because I would have said the same thing listening to someone else tell this story. But I'd spent 31 years at a dispatch center, and I'd sat in on enough detective briefings over the years to understand one thing clearly. One piece of evidence is not the same as a case. If I confronted Linda that morning, she would deny it. She would say the camera was an invasion of privacy and potentially inadmissible. She would say my father was confused and had imagined it, and that the video proved nothing more than her checking on him in the night. She might be right. I needed more. I needed it documented. I needed it airtight. More than that, I needed to call a lawyer before I did anything else. I found an elder law attorney through a referral from a retired detective I'd worked alongside for years. Her name was Patricia Dunn, and her office was in Brentwood. I called her that morning and made an appointment for the following day, telling Linda I had a checkup with my cardiologist. I drove to Patricia's office with my laptop and showed her the video. She watched it twice. When she looked up at me, her expression was careful and very steady. She told me what I had was significant, that what I'd captured on that recording was clear evidence of elder abuse and emotional and physical abuse of a vulnerable adult, which carries serious criminal weight in Tennessee. She also explained something I hadn't fully understood. The camera had been placed in my own home, in a room I had full access to and legal authority over. My father lived in that room as a member of our household. I was his primary caregiver. In Tennessee, recording in your own home does not require the consent of all parties, particularly when the purpose is to document suspected abuse of a person in your care. The recording was legal, but she wanted more. She wanted a pattern of conduct, multiple incidents, not just one. She told me to keep the camera running for several more nights, to save the recordings to an encrypted drive, and not to confront Linda or change my behavior in any way that might tip her off. Every additional night of footage, she said, removes any possibility of arguing this was a one-time incident or a misunderstanding. It becomes impossible to dismiss. I want to be honest about those next 4 nights, because I know what people think when they hear that a man kept a camera rolling while his elderly father was being hurt. I know, because I thought it myself every single morning when I sat at my desk and watched the night's recordings before Linda came home from wherever she'd been. I thought, you could stop this today. You could walk downstairs right now and end this. And every morning, Patricia's voice answered me. 1 incident is an allegation. 5 is a criminal pattern. Your father will be safer after an arrest that sticks than after a confrontation that falls apart. The nights were all variations of the same video. Not every night, but most of them. She would come in between midnight and 2 in the morning. Sometimes she'd grab his arm. Once, she pressed her palm against his mouth and told him to be quiet when he began to make a sound. She threatened him consistently, variations of the same threat, that if he said anything to me, she would make sure he ended up in a facility so understaffed and indifferent that I'd be lucky to visit twice a year, and he'd be lucky to see his grandchildren before he died. She told him he was a foolish old man, and that no one would believe him. On the 5th morning, I saved all 6 recordings to an encrypted drive and called Patricia and told her I had what she needed. But before I went to the police, Patricia told me there was one more step. I needed to take my father to his doctor and have him examined. I needed the bruises documented medically, on record, by a physician who would serve as a mandatory reporter. The medical documentation, combined with the video, would make the case complete from multiple independent angles. I told my father I was taking him in for a regular checkup. He didn't argue. He'd been so quiet the past week, so small, moving through the house like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. In the car on the way to the doctor's office, I put my hand briefly on his arm, on the arm with the worst bruising, and he flinched. "I'm sorry," I said. He looked at me and he said, "I have nothing to be sorry for." I didn't correct him. Not yet. His doctor was Dr. Anita Reeves, who'd been treating him since he moved in, and who I'd called ahead to explain what I suspected. She examined him thoroughly. She photographed every bruise, and there were more than I'd seen. Places I hadn't seen because they were on his torso, his ribs, places that don't show when a person is dressed. She was quiet and professional and very gentle with him. When she finished the physical examination, she sat down across from him and told him that everything she saw in her examination today was confidential and protected, that what he said in this room was between a doctor and her patient and a concerned family member, and that whatever he told her he had not done wrong and was not in trouble. My father looked at his hands. He looked at me, and then he talked. He told Dr. Reeves about the nights. He was halting, sometimes confused about the exact sequence of events, his memory for specific dates, unreliable in the way that comes with vascular dementia. But the central facts were consistent and clear. His daughter-in-law had been coming into his room at night for weeks. She had told him he was a burden on me, that he was ruining my retirement, that I resented having him there, even if I was too polite to say so. She had hurt his arms. She had once hit him with her open hand across the face. And he'd felt too ashamed to tell me because he'd been certain, absolutely certain, that I would not believe a confused old man over my own wife of 35 years. She had told him exactly that, in those exact words, often enough that he'd believed it completely. I had to step out of the examination room for a few minutes. I stood in the hallway of that medical office, and I breathed, and I put myself back together. Then I went back in. Dr. Reeves filed her mandatory reporter documentation before we left the office. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from a detective at the Metro Nashville Police Department with my encrypted drive and my laptop and a printed summary of what Dr. Reeves had documented. The detective, a man named Sergeant Alan Croft, who had the manner of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything, watched every video. He watched them without expression. When they ended, he sat back and looked at me and said he'd been working elder abuse cases for 9 years and that what I had was about as clean a documentation package as he'd ever seen brought in voluntarily. They asked if Linda was home. I said she would be home by 4. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. Dad and I waited at a coffee shop nearby while Sergeant Croft and his partner went to the house. I drank coffee I didn't taste, and my father ordered a piece of pie and ate about half of it, and then put his fork down and said, "Tommy, you believed me." He said it the way a person says something they'd stopped expecting to be true. I said I did. He nodded slowly. That's all I'm going to say about that moment, because some things aren't mine to describe. Sergeant Croft called me at 4:45. He told me Linda had been taken into custody. She denied everything initially, said my father was senile and that I was having a breakdown, that the videos were doctored or taken out of context. When they showed her the full recordings, all 6 nights, she stopped talking and asked for a lawyer. She was charged with elder abuse, assault of a vulnerable adult, and intentional infliction of bodily harm on an elderly person. In Tennessee, abuse of an elderly or vulnerable adult is a Class C felony when it involves physical harm. She was booked, processed, and held pending a bail hearing. Dad and I went home to a quiet house. I made him dinner, something simple, soup and cornbread. We ate at the kitchen table, and afterward he asked if he could call Marcus. I handed him my phone. I stepped outside onto the back porch and let them talk. And through the window, I could hear my father's voice. Not the careful, small voice he'd been using for weeks, but something closer to his old voice, and I was grateful for that. The legal process was long and not always easy. Linda made bail. She moved to her cousin's house in Murfreesboro under a no-contact order. She hired a defense attorney who was aggressive and willing to argue almost anything, including that the recordings represented an illegal invasion of privacy and that my father's dementia made him an unreliable, corroborating witness. Patricia dismantled both arguments methodically. The recordings were made by a homeowner in his own residence, documenting suspected abuse of a person in his legal care. And Dr. Reeves' physical evidence didn't require my father to remember a single thing. The bruises spoke on their own. I filed for divorce the week after the arrest. Linda contested it. She tried to claim that I had been emotionally manipulative throughout our marriage, that she had been under extreme stress as an unwilling caregiver, that my father had been aggressive and combative with her. I let Patricia handle all of it. I was done defending myself against accusations from someone I'd watched, on video, press her hand over an 87-year-old man's mouth in the dark. The criminal trial was in February of the following year. My father testified. I sat beside him in the waiting room beforehand, and he was nervous, his hands trembling, and I couldn't tell anymore how much was Parkinson's and how much was memory. But when they called him, and he walked slowly to the witness stand and sat down, he was steady. He answered the prosecutor's questions clearly and without embellishment. When the defense attorney tried to suggest that his memory was unreliable, my father looked at her with an expression I remembered from childhood. The expression that meant, "I have been patient, but I am done being patient now," and he said his memory was not perfect, but he knew what had been done to him in his own bed in his son's house, and that he knew it the same way he knew his own name. The jury was in deliberation for less than 4 hours. Guilty, on all counts. The judge sentenced Linda to 2 years in a Tennessee State Correctional Facility, followed by 4 years probation. She was barred for life from working in any capacity with elderly, disabled, or otherwise vulnerable individuals. She would carry a felony conviction for the rest of her life. Our divorce was finalized 4 months into her sentence. I kept the house. I didn't particularly want the house, but I wanted her to have no reason to come back to it. I changed the locks anyway. My father lived with me for another 8 months after the trial. Marcus flew in from Phoenix with his family and stayed for 2 weeks, and watching my father sit in the backyard with his 2 granddaughters climbing on him was something I needed more than I had known. His Parkinson's progressed. The dementia was slower moving, but present. By the following autumn, it was clear that he needed a level of care I couldn't responsibly provide alone, not because I didn't want to, but because he needed someone with him around the clock, and I am one person. We found a place in Clarksville, close to where he'd spent most of his life. A memory care and assisted living facility with staff that I interviewed the way I used to interview people calling in emergencies, looking for composure and competence and genuine attention. The facility director let me come in unannounced 3 times before I agreed to the placement. The staff there are attentive and kind, and they have a zero-tolerance policy for any form of resident mistreatment that their state inspection records support. I visit my father 4 times a week. Some days he knows me immediately, lights up, asks what took me so long. Some days he thinks I'm someone else, an old friend of his, or a man he worked with decades ago. I go along with it. I sit beside him, and I listen to whatever story he wants to tell me, whether it's true, whether it's from this decade or another one entirely. And I hold on to every word, because that's the job now. Not dispatching emergencies, not running a household, not maintaining a marriage, just being present for a man who spent 87 years being present for everyone else. Linda got out of the correctional facility last spring. I have no idea where she is, and I have made no effort to find out. She is not permitted to contact me or my father. Whatever curiosity I might once have had about what led her to become someone capable of what she did, what broke, or was always broken underneath the surface, I've let that go. It doesn't serve me or my father to carry that question. What I do carry is something different. I carry the memory of waiting too long. I carry those weeks between when I first noticed something was wrong and when I put that camera in the room. All those mornings, I told myself I was probably imagining things. All those nights, I lay awake, rationalizing. I know, logically, that I needed evidence. I know that I acted as quickly as I reasonably could once I understood what was happening. Patricia told me that. Sergeant Croft told me that. I know it. But knowing something and being fully at peace with it are different things, and I don't think I will ever be entirely at peace with the weeks my father spent afraid in a room in my own home while I was sleeping down the hall. I'm telling you this because I don't want anyone else to sleep down the hall. Elder abuse is not a nursing home problem or a stranger danger problem. It happens in houses that look like mine. It's perpetrated by people who look like Linda, looked like a normal spouse, a responsible adult, someone with a book club and a church volunteer schedule. It happens to people like my father. Strong people, people who built things with their hands, who are humiliated by their own vulnerability and terrified that the people they love most won't believe them. And it thrives in exactly the environment Linda cultivated. Silence, shame, and the calculated isolation of a person who has no one but you to turn to. If you have an elderly parent or grandparent in your life and something feels wrong, trust what you're feeling. Not the anxious voice that catastrophizes everything, but the quiet, steady voice underneath it, the one that keeps returning to the same small detail you can't quite explain. Trust that voice. Ask direct questions. Take unexplained bruises seriously. Pay attention to whether your parent behaves differently around certain people. And if you have a parent living in your home with someone other than you providing care, even part-time, even someone you've known for decades, do not assume that love prevents cruelty. I know better than most people that it doesn't. Document what you observe. Write down dates, what you saw, the exact words used. Photograph injuries. Talk to their doctor. If you suspect abuse is happening right now, contact the Tennessee Adult Protective Services or your state's equivalent, the National Elder Abuse Hotline at 1-800-677-1116 or law enforcement directly. You do not need to be certain. You do not need perfect evidence. That is their job to gather. Your job is to make the call. If you're watching this and you are an older person who is being mistreated by someone you live with or depend on, I want to say something directly to you. You are not a burden. I know someone may have told you that you are, may have told you it so often and so convincingly that it's become something you believe about yourself. It is not true. What is being done to you is not your fault and is not something you deserve. Not for being ill, not for being slow, not for needing help, none of it. You have worth that has nothing to do with what you can or cannot do on your own anymore. And there are people, doctors, social workers, law enforcement, family members who may not yet know what is happening but would act if they did, who will help you if you can find a way to tell someone. Tell someone, my father is 77 days away from his 89th birthday. I know because he told me on the phone last Thursday at 7 in the evening, same as always, that he's planning to make it to 90 and that he expects a proper cake. I told him I'd make it myself. He laughed and said that was either a threat or a promise, and he wasn't sure which. Then he told me a story I've heard before about the first house he ever built in 1971, and how the plumbing inspector showed up on the coldest morning of the year. I listened to every word. I'm grateful for every single word. If this story matters to you, if it sounds like something you've seen or something you've lived, please share it. The more we talk about what happens behind closed doors to people who can't always speak up for themselves, the harder it becomes for it to keep happening in the dark. That's the only reason I'm here telling you this. Not for sympathy, not for judgment of anyone involved, just to shine a light where it's needed. Thank you for listening.